In this video that was co-written by writer and artist Commodity Creature and theorist Mike Watson, we talk about societal collapse and the existential fear of death, which are both reoccurring themes in Roderick's work, no doubt in part as he led a tragic life, as brilliantly told through a memoriam written by his son, the poet Max Roderick. This essay also includes ideas from Die Wise by Stephen Jenkinson and How Everything Can Collapse, a Manual for Our Times by Pablo Servigne and Raphaël Stevens. Culture activist, teacher, author, and carer for the dying, Stephen Jenkinson, opens his book Die Wise with a thought about the tourists who invade the place he lives during the holidays with their motorboats and gas guzzlers. What if those people could stand on the shore watching their wake wash a bit of the shore away? And what if each of us could stay put long enough to see the rippling trail of everything we did rolling out behind us? What if we stopped long enough to see the long train of unintended consequences fan out from every innocently intended thing we did? We'd no doubt be shocked, sickened even, by the consequences of our individual actions. Certainly, the pace of the 21st century life and the interconnectedness of lives separated by vast distances can become overwhelming. Careers and relationships can be made and broken in an instant. For people already prone to depression and anxiety, this is all fodder for melodrama. Anything up to and including loss of credibility, livelihood, and possibly your life can happen at any moment. Anyone can enter or exit your life. With this in mind, even simple gestures can become heavy with meaning. The sufferer of anxiety might agonize over whether to place their coffee cup on the counter an inch to the left or to the right. After all, the decision might have planetary consequences. And this is an entirely natural adaptation to society grown wild. As our innate capacity to ward off danger and death goes into overdrive, given the risk that seem to lurk everywhere, but mostly on screens. Death, while always an important figure, plays a particularly strong role in shaping our reality in the era of COVID lockdown. And this is doubly hard for us as, aside from our own increased probability of dying or losing loved ones, capitalist society, anyhow, finds death to be an affront to its rationalist superiority. Despite dying being the only certainty we face, death, personal or cultural, is no longer the way things are supposed to go. This is unfair, we might think. We had so much potential. Jenkinson has insight into why we feel this way. When you worship in the temple of want, your death is an insult, the ultimate arbitrary frustration of your right to have things go as you deserve until you decide otherwise. We fight death perhaps in part as we are so accustomed to a daily fight against a wider collapse of society, of our belief system, or truth itself, and most crucially of our basic economic and infrastructural support structures. The philosophers of postmodernity and the Frankfurt School before them have for 50 years linked our societal collapse with the organization of power. As philosopher and popularizer of critical theory, Roderick states in an essay he wrote on Derrida called Reading Derrida Politically. To quote Lyotard, "Reason and power are one and the same. You can dress up the first with prognosis or with the dialectic, but you still have the other dished up intact. Prisons, prohibitions, selection processes, the public good." This move of identifying reason with power and domination was already carried out by Horkheimer and Adorno in the Dialectic of Enlightenment. For Foucault, Derrida, and Lyotard, reason always has been about domination, of nature and of man. Ultimately, it is about warding off that most basic threat from nature, death itself. Roderick goes on in that same essay to quote a situationist pamphlet with no specific author given. in which it states that, if it seems somewhat ridiculous to talk of revolution, this is obviously because the organized revolutionary movement has long since disappeared from the modern countries, where the possibilities of a decisive transformation of society are concentrated. And a little later, the ruling society has proved capable of defending itself on all levels of reality, much better than revolutionaries expected. Not that it has become more tolerable. Revolution has to be reinvented. That's all. For the situationists, the language of mass media would be turned against its capitalist owners through slogans, pamphlets, and posters, a kind of precursor to culture jamming. Derrida's engagement with the canons of text that inform our ostensibly rationalist society as a means of taking them apart accords with the belief that the underlying means of organization in a capitalist society are fundamentally geared to oppression, necessitating a deconstruction of discourse before we deconstruct the economy. Roderick wrote, "A truly revolutionary theory would conceive capitalism not as a mode of production based on the laws of the economy, but rather as a mode of discourse based on what Baudrillard calls the terrorism of the code. The attack on the prevailing modes of discourse undertaken by the strong textualists belongs to this conceptual move in radical French theory, a move that belongs to the attempt to reinvent revolution." In doing so, he identifies a strong political intent on the postmodern deconstruction of language and preferencing of literary games over an engagement with the Enlightenment principle of rationality. Following precursors to postmodernism, Adorno and Horkheimer's identification of totalitarianism as embedded in the rationalist tendency towards the categorization and control of nature, it's necessary to overturn both fascism and bourgeois liberalism as correlates to rationalism, via an abstract disruption of culture. This is certainly clear enough as a premise, though nearly 70 years after Adorno and Horkheimer wrote The Dialectic of Enlightenment, and over 50 years since the first postmodern texts, including Derrida's Writing Indifference, maybe we need to reassess. Not because we need more rationality, but because we're a fair way into seeing the fruits of its dismantling. The bourgeois niceties that Adorno, Derrida, and Foucault wish to dismantle because they hide barbarity have been to a large degree dispensed with in political discourse. For this we can partly thank the aforementioned theorists, though it may have a lot more to do with the existence of the internet, fostering the conditions for a collapse in discourse. Now, Adorno, Foucault, and Derrida are just memes competing in a sea of shitpost. After all, what is there to deconstruct in the era of collapse? The engineer Jean-Pierre Dupuy talks of what he calls enlightened catastrophism, where the threats that present themselves to us today shouldn't be viewed as fateful probabilities of risk, but as certainties. Accepting them as inevitable will enable us to handle them as they need to be handled. Collapse is certain, and that's why it is not tragic. It just is. Likewise, death is certain, and that is why it is not tragic. Collapse of our discourse, of our society, or our ecology is here. It is no longer purely conjectural. Roderick himself often spoke of society being in a state of deterioration in his 3 video lecture series published by the Teaching Company between 1991 and 1993. Philosophy and Human Values, Nietzsche and the Postmodern Condition, and The Self Under Siege. In the first lecture of the 3rd series, entitled Masters of Suspicion, Roderick identifies a collapse in meaning, deriving from an overflow of bureaucratic and mediatic information.
To give you an example that may be more immediate, think of the JFK assassination. Is our problem there lack of complexity? Lack of information? No. No, we know too damn much about it. Way too much. There are too many possible assassins, too many secret plots, too many movies, too many books. And under this kind of complexity, the self finds itself in a position where the array of choices of what to believe or not to believe become bewildering, utterly bewildering. Now, this is about events like, the assassination and so on. But, the more important beliefs or beliefs about ourselves become equally bewildering.
We are collapsing under the weight of information, and not information that we might make use of, as the bourgeois rationalist of the Enlightenment would have hoped. We have no meaningful conception of truth, which is a problem we most definitely suffer from in the Trumpian and post-truth era. Talking about the societal malaise, Roderick speaks timelessly, once again when he says that technical reason produces
the situation in which human beings themselves don't feel rational. And especially with a younger audience, and I think this is really true with the 20 or 30 somethings that are out there listening to me. Ask around and see how many of your friends, if you think the self isn't under siege in the late 20th century, ask yourself how many of your friends are on 12-step programs to stop something. Ask yourselves, given the current use of the word dysfunctional, who's not?
Roderick, like most philosophers, doesn't give any solutions. And in any case, this is not a problem to be solved, but a predicament that we all find ourselves in. Trying to solve things all too often ends in calamity. In looking for answers in how to deal with, if not solve, individual death and societal collapse, we perhaps could do no better than to look at an expert in death and dying. Returning to the book Die Wise, Stephen Jenkinson, who has experience as a palliative care expert, says that we need to bring a sense of wonder back to life and death. Wonder serves mystery with grace and a humble approach. Resolving mystery is like dissecting someone you love to find out how they got so lovable. Wonder relies on somehow throwing a spanner in the demystifying project of rationality, just as Derrida and Adorno and Horkheimer proposed. One way to bring back a sense of wonder is to expand our understanding of what sentience means. Stephen Jenkinson asks us to open our minds to the possibility of humans or particular animals not having a monopoly on sentience. In the same way that death is not a human thing, neither is life. This may make the transition to death easier. Jenkinson states, "We have religions that sanctify all sentient beings, which is good for the sentient beings they have in mind, but this still ties life to having eyelashes, or a central nervous system, or a pulse. We are denying this quality of sentience to mountains, rivers, the air, the ground, and all that sustains us at our considerable peril, and to the demonstrable corruption of the world. We should rather at least consider that mountains, rivers, the air, and the ground are all ways life has of being sentient. The realization that the humbling power of knowing that life is not a human thing could go a long way towards making us human." Mapping this motion onto societal collapse would mean recognizing our industrial complex as no different from, and perhaps even inferior to, the objective processes of nature. The refining of oil and its eventual use to fuel vehicles is perhaps no different to the natural creation of oil. We are not superior to nature. Yet why do we have such trouble in seeing ourselves as linked to nature, as in a sense already dead, as already oil? This blind spot in identifying our linkedness to nature, long ago identified by Adorno and Horkheimer, is discussed by Pablo Servigne and Raphaël Stevens in How Everything Can Collapse, in relation to what they term socio-technical lock-in. We all stop at the petrol station to fill our tanks because our ancestors, some of them, decided at a certain point to generalize the use of the thermal engine, the car, and oil. We are stuck in the technological choices of these ancestors. Current technological trajectories are therefore largely determined by our past. Quite often, technological innovations are just trying to solve the problem caused by previous ones. This path-dependent evolution can, in many ways, lead to technological dead ends, trapping us in increasingly counterproductive choices. In a sense, we cannot see ourselves as connected to oil as a natural resource, as we have done so much to extract it, refine it, and put it to use in our ostensibly advanced vehicular mechanisms, that we have trouble seeing what it or we really are. At one point, Jenkinson recounts a story about a particular patient. He had saved every nameplate from every office and every clinic and hospital and university he had ever worked. And they were all in the death room with him. Bronze and silver and stainless steel, declarations over and over of his name and his degrees and his accomplishments and his status in the world. Reiterations that he was still what he was, that he would die an oncologist, that his competence and mastery would survive what he would not survive. Testimonials all to the quality of his old life. The most energetic and resilient fear Jenkinson has seen in his time working with dying people is that life will go on. That the living will continue to be the living and be able to proceed as if the dying person is past, done, over. In some way as if the person had never really enduringly been. We often go about most of our lives without realizing, as Jenkinson puts it, that the real substance of our lives is contained in its witness, that our life is tangible in how it is to others, in the relationships we were part of. We are real, in other words, to the extent that those around us grant us our reality, and we theirs. This is perhaps the problem we have in processing our connection to nature. We each resent nature as it will eventually cause our death, and will live after us. If we think of the origins of oil, which comes from dead organisms, we admit that we may become oil. And this ruins the illusion of airplanes as symbols of human superiority. This reminds me of the MF Doom lyric from the song Accordion. Is he still a fly guy clapping if nobody ain't hear it? And can they testify from the inner spirit? MF Doom himself died in October 2020. Rest in peace. We can't individually or as a species cope with the idea of our irrelevance, of people one day forgetting us. As Roderick states in his lecture, Sartre and the Road to Freedom, the only way we can cope with death is through its commodification. Taking the great American genius of marketing, he says,
Of course, you know the great American genius for marketing. And this goes right to the point of the self under siege. Now you've got a movement, you've got people, oh, this is a way to find my authentic selfhood. I've got to free myself from these conformists and from all this old religious stuff that used to hold me back. So I'll be a nonconformist, I'll dress in black, I'll read Heidegger and Sartre, I'll listen to this different music, and we'll all go out and be different together, and then pretty soon you've got a whole new industry selling dark clothes and weird funky music and coffee houses on every block because Americans can even market death.
Though of course this marketing is ultimately another attempt to co-opt nature, death, and societal collapse. Even today's doomer memes, while expressing abject depression, play into the algorithm of the data economy. Even depressive lassitude is somehow marketable, as those who don't have the energy to buy goth or emo accessories can still click on doomer memes and register their apathy for the marketers to take into account. Roderick would likely see a Kafka-esque absurdity here. But somewhere in his own depressive attitude there is, one senses, a strong belief in the political import and the situationist and Derrida's attempts to disrupt culture. Today that possibility exists like never before. Given the access of the mass to tools for the publishing of text and moving and still images, that is, if we're not too busy counting our visitor numbers, likes, and followers. Today, we can further aid the collapse than at any other time in history. Come on, how many rhetorical kicks before the edifice comes crumbling down? Speaking of which, how are things going where you are? Coronavirus, mass protest, political tension, ecological catastrophe? How will you contend with them? We at the Acid Left wish you a happy collapse.